Negotiations between the United States and Russia, which took place in Riyadh, have yielded no results for now. Earlier today, the American delegation met with their Ukrainian counterparts. The discussions were aimed at securing a maritime ceasefire. Yesterday's talks between the US and Russia went on for 12 hours, but no joint statement was reached. For more on this story, we can bring in John Herbst, Senior Director at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, as well as a former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine. Thank you very much for joining us on the program today. Now, we have these talks that were underway in Riyadh. Yesterday, we had 12 hours of negotiations between the U.S. and the Russian side. Why is it taking so hard to reach a breakthrough on this maritime ceasefire, considering there was already one in the past?
We don't have, at this point, details on the talks. We do know that Putin has no interest in having an overall ceasefire. He wants to continue his war on land. A ceasefire at sea is something which, in theory, should be achievable because the Russian Black Sea fleet has been driven out of the central and western part of the Black Sea and out of Crimea by Ukrainian drones. So until we have more information, it's not clear why there's not an agreement on a naval ceasefire. But the reason why there's no overall ceasefire is Putin wants to continue taking more Ukrainian territory. That is the problem.
Indeed, we do have Russia that has claimed more in eastern Ukraine today, more territory in eastern Ukraine. Last week, we had a much hyped call between the U.S. president and Russia's Vladimir Putin. Then a day later, we had Zelensky, who was briefed on the outcome of that call. And it seemed that there was a ceasefire reached in theory on energy infrastructure. But it seems that Moscow and Ukraine and Kyiv have two very different interpretations of what was agreed to last week. Is there or is there not a ceasefire on Ukrainian energy infrastructure?
Well, I think a ceasefire was reached. But of course, the Russians broke that ceasefire within an hour or two of it being reached, and the Ukrainians responded. I'm not sure there's been much in the way of energy infrastructure attacks since then. So there's a kind of a ceasefire relating to energy installations.
Okay, because it seems that Ukraine wants a ceasefire on energy as well as infrastructure, which are two very different things, because there's one energy infrastructure and there's infrastructure. Yes.
You're absolutely right. And as you'll recall, after that phone call between Putin and Trump, the Russians said this is only on energy, and Trump posted on Truth Social it involved infrastructure too. But then Witkoff, I don't know, a day later, not too long afterwards, said no, the Russians only agreed to a ceasefire on energy installations because there too, Ukraine has been very effective going after Russian hydrocarbon facilities.
The language out of Washington has changed substantially since January. Before, we'd have President Joe Biden, who said the war would end on Ukraine's terms. Now it seems that the war will end because the U.S. Says it needs to end at some point. When we think of an eventual long-term ceasefire, I think everyone's aware now that Ukraine will have to seize some territory. Would that have been the case even if the Democrats had won the White House?
Well, you recall that at various times Biden and his team said, well, it's unlikely Ukraine can take back some or most of the territory that the Russians have conquered. But it was never explicit. And they always say Ukraine has to make its own decisions. Trump is trying to push both sides into a peace. And the peace that Trump is talking about requires compromise from Ukraine on territory in NATO, but it also requires compromise from Russia on the security that would make it much harder for Russia to take control of most of the country. So Trump's proposed, putting European troops into Ukraine to deter future Russian aggression, and also to continue arming Ukraine substantially so Russia, again, does not attack after a ceasefire. And we know that Zelensky has nodded, not happily, but nodded to the concept of compromise on territory, and even on NATO. And the Russians have categorically rejected either European troops in Ukraine or, for that matter, continuing weapons arms supplies to Ukraine. So it's clear who the impediment to a ceasefire is.
Because, Mr. Ambassador, one of the proposals the Europeans, the British, and the French have been toying with is this idea of forming a coalition of the willing to oversee any ceasefire in Ukraine. However, Steve Witkoff, who appeared with Tucker Carlson just a couple of days ago, said this is posture and pose and called it simplistic. Trump, up until now, has been calling for Europe to do more to secure itself. However, when Europe says this is what we're willing to do, the Trump administration says no.
You're right that Witkoff apparently has contradicted Trump. And obviously, the president is the guy who makes the decisions. But that statement by Witkoff, among other statements by Witkoff, have raised questions about what the Trump administration is up to, and there's not clarity right now on that point. But it is worth recalling that just 3 weeks ago, Trump greeted Starmer and Macron in separate visits to the White House very favorably because of their efforts on putting together this coalition of the willing.
Indeed, but then we saw how the interaction with Vladimir Zelensky ended. Let me talk about another thing Steve Witkoff floated. This is the idea of giving Ukraine Article 5 protections, but not giving them member status of NATO. Is this something that would be palatable for the Russians, for the Americans, and for the Europeans?
Of course, it would not be palatable for the Russians. I think if the Trump administration were pushed today on this question, they would not be enthusiastic. Where they might be, in the months to come as the war drags on is a whole different question. Because again, Putin is dead determined to take more Ukrainian land because he wants to establish effective political control over that country.
I don't know if you heard my previous conversation with my colleague about this bombshell revelation from Jeffrey Goldberg with The Atlantic that he was mistakenly included on a group chat. Now, one of the things that was discussed was European freeloading, something between the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance said. Does the United States no longer consider Europe an ally?
It does, but we've seen a very peculiar approach by this administration or members of this administration towards our allies. I mean, it's hard to really explain what Trump is doing relating to Canada or relating to Denmark, two exemplary allies. And we do know that, in the first term, Trump was very hard on Germany. And while Germany at that time was appeasing Russia left and right, I'm not certain that we should have approached it the way that Trump did. Of course, I also critical of Biden for going along with German appeasement of Russia during his term. But this is not a good thing for the United States. It's not a good thing for the Western world because our alliance system, our friends, make us stronger. And it's a very nasty world out there, as the Russians demonstrate in Ukraine every day. And the Chinese, too, are rather aggressive as we watch their wolf diplomacy in Southeast Asia and in the Western Pacific. So we need our friends.
Sorry to jump in there, but just before I end the interview with you, you were a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. We know that the Trump administration seems to be in a hurry to end this war. But when we hear people like Steve Witkoff, who are at the forefront, essentially, of negotiating an end to this war, he seems to have he seems to try and want to paint a very different picture of Vladimir Putin. This is, of course, somebody who has sat in front of Vladimir Putin in recent months, and he seems to say that he's willing for peace. He doesn't have ambitions to take all of Europe. What would you advise the U.S. delegation as a former ambassador yourself?
I think that statements like that do not make the United States look strong. I think they are naive at best. It's possible that this is a calculated ploy to try and somehow jolly Putin into making concessions. But the history of U.S. Soviet and U.S.-Russian relations suggests that when an aggressive nation is pursuing policies that contradict American interests, what you need is countermeasures and strength, not kind words and caresses, to persuade them to desist in their threats to the United States and our allies and our friends. Mr. Witkoff is a very successful businessman. I think he needs some advisors as he conducts his diplomatic mission.
We'll see how things pan out on securing an end to the war. Ambassador Herbst, thank you so much for joining us on the program today.